The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A warm welcome to Scorebox Europe. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Karen Cho and Ben Boulos, and these are your headlines. The US and Iran put pen to paper on their MOU, with the peace framework now in effect. Oil sinking on hopes the Strait of Hormuz is set to reopen, but President Trump still warning he will retaliate if Iran violates the deal.
If you don't adhere to the agreement, I don't want to do that, but we're going to bomb the hell out of you. And I don't think that they're going to veer from the agreement.
A hawkish hold from the Federal Reserve in Kevin Warsh's first decision as chair, with officials forecasting rising rates ahead. Warsh underlining his key objective will be to bring inflation back to target.
Inflation has been running well ahead of the Fed's long-stated inflation goal of 2%. That's been going on for more than 5 years. Members of the FOMC are unambiguous and unanimous. This committee will deliver price stability.
The CEOs of Anthropic and Google DeepMind called for the creation of a US-led AI coalition as tech executives and global leaders hold talks at the G7 summit. France's Emmanuel Macron warning against nationalist AI policies.
Until now, there was a prevailing discourse that said nothing should ever be regulated. All this is not dangerous, so it's a good thing there is awareness. It's a bad thing. The reaction is somewhat strictly nationalistic.
And the EU Commissioner for Digital Sovereignty tells CNBC that Europe and the US share the same concerns around AI and cybersecurity, but says the latest restrictions around Anthropic underline the need for Europe to control its own technology and data.
We are looking at which are the very sensitive sectors in our society where we have to be able always control the technologies, that it's European companies who are providing those services, and also that the data is always localized in Europe.
So that hawkish tone with the hold on interest rates from the Fed weighing on market sentiment, you can see it was a negative close across the main US benchmarks. Worth saying they have been hitting some fresh record highs recently, so just a bit of a breather there. One stock to mention, SpaceX, had its first daily decline. It was down by around 5%, of course, in the context of having jumped around 50% since Friday's blockbuster IPO. In terms of how things are playing out in the Asian trading session, it was more of a mixed picture, but one worth mentioning. I'll draw your attention to the Nikkei over there, crossing the 71,000 threshold for the first time ever. Fresh record high. In fact, I think it's hit 4 intraday highs in recent sessions, so performing well despite the rate hike we saw from the Bank of Japan earlier this week. The other markets mixed. The Kospi, though, steaming ahead, up more than 2%. Chip makers really powering the rally there. Quick glance at what's being anticipated when European trading gets underway this Thursday, and again, a bit of a mixed picture. The DAX looking to open flat, the FTSE on the back foot, perhaps being dragged lower by the sentiment around oil prices, which have dropped a further 3% or so today on news of that deal being signed between the US and Iran, and hopes the Strait of Hormuz will reopen, perhaps weighing on some of the stocks on the oil majors listed on the London index. We'll have the market open for you in 25 minutes from now, but in the meantime, let's go straight over to Karen, who's at Vivatech for us in Paris. Karen.
Good morning, Ben. A lot of conversations here about space and the company SpaceX proving it can move in two directions yesterday as Elon Musk's company posted its first losing day after its IPO rally, with the shares sinking almost 5%, meaning it's now up 42% since Friday's listing. The company also announced the election of Roelof Botha, previously at Sequoia Capital, to its board. And another tech news, Apple will increase product prices because of soaring memory chip costs. CEO Tim Cook has told the Wall Street Journal. Cook said price hikes were, quote, unavoidable, but didn't say which products would be affected. Well, here at VivaTech, the European Commission's Executive Vice Principal for Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy, Hanna Virkkunen, told CNBC that the recent move by the US to restrict the use of Anthropic's latest Fable model has emphasized the need for European tech sovereignty. Meantime, speaking to Arjun, she added that the US export controls should not discriminate against trusted partners.
I think it's very important internationally discuss about this topic, and especially with our trusted partners like G7 countries are, that how we are mitigating the risks which are related to these very capable AI models, because I think everybody is having very much the same concerns, especially connected to cybersecurity, because we know that these very capable models, they are able to identify in few hours time also the vulnerabilities in cybersecurity, and I think this is one of the common concerns among our partners. So I think it's important that together we are also solving that kind of challenges.
What was your reaction when the US effectively put an export control on Anthropic's Fable 5 and Mythos models?
I understand that sometimes that kind of mitigating measures are needed, but of course they have to be proportionate and they shouldn't be discriminating trusted partners. And for us as Europeans, of course it tells that how important it is also to build our own tech sovereignty, that we are not dependent on one company or third countries too much when it comes to very critical technologies like AI.
One of the things you've warned about is this ability for countries to have a kill switch around some of these technologies. Is that effectively what we saw in this case with the US?
Of course, these models, what we are now talking about, they are not fully in the markets yet, so they were more in the testing phase. But this is exactly what we want to avoid as Europeans when we speak about tech sovereignty. We want to be sure that when we speak about critical sectors of our economy or society, we are able to always operate and also control the technologies. So that's why just 2 weeks ago we launched our tech sovereignty package. And there, for example, we are focusing very much on cloud services, and we are looking at which are the very sensitive sectors in our society where we have to be able always control the technologies, that it's European companies who are providing those services, and also that the data is always localized in Europe.
One of the things we've seen over the last few years is in China, where the US has restricted access to technology. China has worked very hard to try to build up its own sovereign capabilities. It's a very difficult thing because of the global nature of the supply chain. When you look at the EU has been heavily criticized for its lack of sovereignty, reliant on mainly American technology companies for the technology stack. How does that change?
It's true that Europe has been always very open for global businesses and global investments. And now we have also realized, of course, during the last years that kind of very long global supply chains and the dependencies, they can be also weaponized against us. And that's why we have been identifying really that which are the critical sectors where we have to be sure that we have alternatives. We are not dependent on one country or one company. But of course, in the same time, when we want to build more our own tech sovereignty, it doesn't mean isolation or protectionism. So we want to work with our trusted partners also in the future, because we don't think that anyone can be competitive alone, so everybody needs partners in the same time.
Arjun also spoke to the German digital minister Carsten Wilberger and asked about whether discussions were underway where G7 partners may get access to US models.
This is not a subject matter where I would say, because the news are traveling in at light speed, so I'm not on top of the latest news, and it would be not the right idea to comment on something that is still in flux. The thing I would say, having agreed on a very complex matter in a beautiful way together with our French friends on sovereignty means a lot, and it gives us everything to do to focus on our capabilities and move forward. Do we have the capabilities? Do we have the talents? Absolutely. Now it's about really pooling resources and going all in and using the talents that we have. Obviously, there is a lot of ground to catch up on. On the other hand, the only way is to do exactly this. Is this a long way still? Yeah, but we have the capability. And most important is we have the ambition, and now we have to have the courage to get this done.
What's going to be the big focus? Is it catching up on the frontier model? Is it infrastructure in terms of data centers, GPUs, etc.?
Well, Well, if you talk about AI, obviously you need to have infrastructure, you need to have compute, you need to do the work on the model, and there are different models. We are also world-class in certain categories like vision models, world models, and then it's about diffusion, applying AI. So we have to work on all fronts, and I think there is not just one thing you have to do, and that's what we're doing.
And Arjun has joined me now too. We've both been having so many discussions with policymakers, regulators. A couple of points to make. I think that Europe is absolutely spooked by Anthropic hitting the kill switch on its models the other week. Whether it was the US government involved here as well or not, I think the fact that access was retracted. And keep in mind, it's not just the US government saying, oh, we have a powerful model here, let's turn the off switch, let's disable it because we're not sure of the capabilities. Earlier in the year, they were encouraging Anthropic to give them some of the models because they wanted to use it for defense purposes. So the state of flux, I think, around the Trump administration and how it's dealing with tech is impacting how Europe now thinks about control over technology. Add into that another layer, and we saw a story yesterday, and this was at the national level, where the French government was saying, well, look, we're going to replace AI tools from Palantir, a gigantic company in the cybersecurity space, with a little French startup that barely has any significant revenue at this point, so it's clearly going to need scale over coming years. So I think there's a lot of moving pieces here that could have a huge narrative for European startups, but also could provoke trade fights with the Americans.
What I think the Anthropic episode exposed is what we already knew. There's no real European replacement at this point to an Anthropic or an OpenAI on that frontier level, and that goes all the way down the technology stack when you think about chips to data centers and all the other pieces of the puzzle there as well. And so that is a huge issue, and I think Europe's almost getting the China treatment now. Export controls on advanced technology is what China's had to deal with for several years from various US governments, around chips and of course around all these AI models. And Europe's starting to see some of that now. There's been a long-running discussion we know here in the EU around sovereignty and the need for Europe to have its own technology stack, etc. Those conversations now are just being exacerbated. We're hearing them more and more and more.
The Americans are doing it too. I mean, there was a discussion yesterday that came out that Trump was highlighting that Apple had agreed to work with Intel to design and manufacture chips in the United States. So again, taking the onus away from TSMC and away from Taiwan. But what comes into the mix here is the very expensive models and just how these frontier models and the very big investment stateside have run a lot further than what you've seen elsewhere, and whether there's any form of catch-up. But what's interesting is the technology itself, because you've been having conversations about what type of models are going to be the ones we rely on in future. And there's already some evidence suggesting, look, it's not these huge expensive models, it's smaller models, but it's world models. The conversations you've been having about how this gets adopted.
Yeah, and the sort of landscape of the models are constantly changing. We've had a lot of conversations where people are saying, well, look, there is this layer where there's very expensive, high-performance models, but actually, they're not the models you require for all the other tasks that we need day to day, right?
Which is hard to catch up on. The expensive models you can't catch up on.
You can't catch up on.
The other ones you can.
Absolutely, and you're seeing a lot of work around open source models and cheaper models. Mistral here in France, for example, is working on a lot of those kind of models that potentially could be useful for more of the generalized tasks. And so I think that's an interesting part of the puzzle. And then those are all based around large language models, for example, but also you've got this emerging area of so-called world models. Now, as you think about AI hitting the industrial sector, robotics, automation, machinery, etc., there's a view that actually models based on language are not going to be good enough in the real world, where you have robotics, automation, etc., around warehouses, around factories and industry that need to perceive the world around it. There's an emerging sort of area around world models, which many see as quite promising for these other areas and to get to true intelligence.
That's a really interesting point. I'll just highlight this to the audience, because you had another conversation early in the week with Qualcomm, and they were talking about all the different form factors they're bringing to market, which basically means something that is not a smartphone. And I spoke to a company here on the ground at Viva. They're working on contact lenses. So if you think about text and images coming through on contact lenses, not having to rely on a smartphone to watch a movie, to navigate the streets, same sort of lenses picking up the world around us, all that information can eventually be fed into a world model that you're talking about, not using a large language model to train, but using what we're picking up in our day-to-day lives to train a model.
That's exactly right. That is the sort of data that these world models require. It's images, it's video, it's looking at movement and how people move around. So all of those kind of devices going to be pretty key to training those models. Another big conversation that I feel is emerging here a lot, and it is around sovereignty, is quantum. We are seeing more and more discussion around quantum computing. Now, I think it's a very complicated concept, quantum computing, but it's not just faster computers. It's the ability for computing to solve problems that classical computers can't. And when you talk to the industry, they're saying quantum could be very important in discovering new materials, discovering medicines, all this sort of stuff that classical computers can't. Right now, we are in a phase where quantum computers are not useful, and by that we mean they can't do things, they can't achieve things that classical computers can't. And so what's happening now is a lot of development, and a lot of that's happening at the big tech giant. One of those is Amazon. I had a chance to catch up with Peter DeSantis, who's the head of the company's chips, AI frontier models, as well as quantum computing division, and spoke to him about his views on the timeline of when useful quantum computing happens. Let's listen in.
I think there's a lot of buzz out there about quantum computing. One of the misnomers is a quantum computer is going to be a faster computer. That's not it at all. A quantum computer is going to solve a very particular type of problem that isn't solved well today with a classic computer, and it's going to solve it much better. And the problems that I would think are going to be tackled first are the ones that are quantum-based problems. So things like chemistry, material science, those are the physics. These are the problems where today we cannot run high enough fidelity simulations in a classic computer. And once we have a quantum computer, we're going to find some real progress.
Great. Is there a timeline in your view when this happens?
Always 7 years.
Always 7 years.
I actually do believe over the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to start to see the first commercially useful small scale quantum computers. And then from there, we're going to see something that looks a lot like Moore's Law looked, where they're going to get bigger and bigger every year, and they're going to be able to tackle more and more interesting problems for us.
And you can read more about DeSantis' views on CNBC.com, but last year Amazon released a quantum chip, and I think that shows you sort of, the direction of travel. Similar to what they're doing with AI and models and releasing their own chips, they're looking to replicate that in quantum.
Don't write anyone off at this point has been the message from this conference. There's still moving pieces, but space, I think, has been another huge part of the equation. Maybe why quantum is catching some traction now, because the future of technology is moving at pace. We had a conversation on stage yesterday that was reverberating around Vivatech, and that was from Jeff Bezos, of course, the founder of Amazon, founder of Blue Origin. He was talking about heavy industry needing to move off Earth to space, to the moon, in fact. He was talking about this becoming still a livable planet in future, but all the heavy industry that is now required for the build-up, we need to put it somewhere else. I thought that was a fascinating conversation in the context that the market is now so heavily interested in space.
So heavily interested. Look, there's been for a long time this conversation that the moon has resources that can be tapped in order to sort of build out certain things that are currently on Earth. I think there's still a lot of question marks around, in particular, the big topic right now, data centers in space. This is something SpaceX has been talking about. There's still a lot of question marks over whether that is actually viable from a technical perspective. Where does the heat go? How do you run this massive compute centers in space? What does it look like? And actually, is it economically viable to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just because we put our waste and our pollution away from our eyesight and we can't see it, doesn't mean it's not still there. It still has an impact on the planet, and maybe even more so if it is in the upper atmosphere. We're going to wrap up there, but plenty more conversations coming up. I'm going to be speaking to PwC shortly. There is a lot of huge breaking news here live on the ground. Steve, back to you.
Thank you, Karen. Very much enjoying the fact that you and Arjun were doing all the work. Coming up on the show, OPEC prepares to release its world oil outlook as the US-Iran war appears to draw to a close. Dan will be at OPEC live from Vienna. Executive Decisions is the new podcast from CNBC, where I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything. I'm Steve Sedgwick. Here's the CEO of the London Stock Exchange Group, Julia Hoggett.
There is no justification whatsoever for not doing the right thing, even if the right thing is hard to do. Which also means that if the context changes or the information changes, it is absolutely fine to also change your mind.
That's Executive Decisions with me, Steve Sedgwick. Get it wherever you're listening to this. Well, amid the backdrop of disruption from the war in Iran, which has sent shockwave through global energy markets and seen key producers forced to slash output, OPEC is now set to release its 2026 World Oil Outlook today. And Dan's in Vienna for that very event. And Dan, I think it's extraordinary that both the IEA and OPEC can even put out some comprehensive report when there's so much oscillation going around and so much uncertainty.
That's exactly right, Steve. And of course, this also comes as we see the US and Iran signing this interim deal, the Strait of Hormuz now reopening, Brent also collapsing in the last 24 hours, now down more than $40 from its crisis peak and back towards the 70 handle. The question now isn't whether the oil comes back. The question is just how fast and, of course, into what kind of demand as well. The International Energy Agency out yesterday saying global oil demand is actually going to shrink this year, down some 1.1 million barrels a day. That's a really sharp downgrade, and the credibility of some of those numbers also being called into question here. The IEA seeing supply falling to just over 102 million barrels a day before it says a flood is going to return in 2027. And it also warns of a pretty messy recovery moving forward as well, with mine clearing in the Strait of Hormuz, the insurance issue, and of course these unresolved transit challenges through Hormuz, all keeping the risks alive. Well, later today from this building, OPEC is going to release its World Oil Outlook, and this is very closely watched. Essentially, it's going to tell you an opposite long-term story. It's going to say that demand is climbing and there's no real peak in sight. The near-term swing factor is how quickly Gulf supply actually returns. And I spoke with Amrita Sen of Energy Aspects earlier this morning, who really made the case that the region has successfully engineered its way around that choke point. Here's what she told me. Listen in.
I don't think we need Hormuz flows to go back to pre-conflict levels because we have alternatives, right? East-West pipeline, I think the kingdom will continue to flow that, even if it's not full rates, because I think the kingdom of all have shown that investing in redundancy actually pays off, right? And I think Prince Abdulaziz has been saying that to us like for a very, very long time. So they'll keep running that at a certain level. UAE will keep running the Fujairah pipeline even after Hormuz is opened. If anything, UAE is coming and planning for entirely getting free of Hormuz. I think after 2 to 3 years, the region will look very different. But even right here, right now, I think you could have Hormuz flows maybe 2 to 3 million barrels per day lower, even if Saudis divert some of them back to Hormuz. And you don't need it because you've got those alternative routes.
Amrita Sen at Energy Aspects there. As for OPEC itself, I also think it's fair to say that OPEC has come through this conflict tested, but also intact, and its core producers have shown real strategic depth, even with millions of barrels a day shut in at the peak. The Gulf members, of course, kept oil moving by leaning on those alternative routes that Amrita Sen was just talking about. That is Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, the UAE's Fujairah terminal as well, really vindicating what has been years of investment in redundancy outside of the Strait of Hormuz. Yes, I think it is also fair to say the group is a little smaller after the UAE's departure on the 1st of May, but Saudi Arabia's role as the market stabilizer has only really grown here, and the kingdom still holds the bulk of the world's spare capacity, the single most important tool for managing supply moving forward. The reopening of Hormuz also lets OPEC bring some of their stranded barrels back to market, and the ultimate question now is exactly how the group plans to reassert its own hand on supply moving forward, and that is also going to be very closely watched as we continue to monitor not just the geopolitics here, but also the flows through Hormuz and how this market will ultimately price what happens at the end of this 60-day negotiation window as well.